Well, hey everyone. As you can see, I have a friend with me here, Audrey Moore of Lift Up the Vulnerable. She's the CEO there, and I'll introduce her in a second. But here at Groundswell, we have a whole lot more energy to share about the work being done by the people we get to work with and the organizations that we get to work with than sharing about our own work. So that's why we're doing this today, and I get to introduce you to Audrey and Lift Up the Vulnerable and their work, and just have an opportunity to share the amazing work that they're doing and how we've gotten to learn about that amazing work in the time that we've spent working together this year. So Audrey is the CEO of Lift Up the Vulnerable, and we work together on a variety of projects this year, and I've really enjoyed getting to know you, Audrey, and really taking a deep dive into the work that you do, and from a messaging standpoint, design, and some other projects that we've had the opportunity to work on. So let's start off by just giving you an opportunity to tell a little bit about yourself and what led you to the kind of work that you're doing right now.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really honored that you would even invite me to be a part of this. Bill, for all of you who don't know, Bill saved my life. Because he also provides coaching, and as part of one of his services at Groundswell. And I entered in 2018 as the CEO of Lift Up the Vulnerable, but I was really quickly way in over my head. And Bill, you just provided such a good gift of being a kind ear, having wisdom, and traveled this route before in past lives. And so
Yeah.
I've really just appreciated working with you and having your support. So I was glad that it could progress into a brand messaging guide, our lovely website, and some other projects. So it's really a gift to be able to work.
Thank you for that. No, I appreciate that a lot. You made it really easy to work together. So
yeah,
the starting point was a beautiful one that we got to start off on. So yeah, that's great.
So I got into this work. I learned about, so can I start with what Lift Up the Vulnerable does? And then
sure. No, go for it. However you want to frame it.
Lift Up the Vulnerable is preventing human trafficking and empowering children that live in war zones to be change makers. And I got into this work really seems like decades ago. And in 2003, I was living overseas, and I learned about human trafficking firsthand, and was working at a children's home in the summer. I went to live in Belgium after I graduated from university, and was engaging and doing different things with international students through the Episcopal Church and Catholic Church in Belgium. Internationals, so English speaking. So I also did a deep dive back then into learning the language of my neighbors, but I was mostly working with international students. And when they would go away for the summer, my summers were open. So I started volunteering, and one of those summers I was working at a children's home in Portugal, and we were doing construction work. And I learned with the organization I was working with at the time that the children there were being used for pornography and prostitution. And we wouldn't really have known that had we not lived there and committed to this long-term project, because everything nefarious can be hidden really well. And so, but when you're there and they're in the midst of it day in and day out, signs become really apparent. And so that was my first entree into human trafficking. And we didn't, back in 2003, human trafficking wasn't a term that was really talked about. Of course, child abuse existed, but the concept, the two words together, human trafficking, was just kind of rising to the surface. But I was learning a lot about what it was and how to get engaged in it. And because of seeing the pain and the heartache and just living through the tragedy of knowing those children, and being engaged, seeing the rescue of one while the home remained open for 2 more years because of bureaucracy and the slow process of the legal court cases in Portugal. It just was really heartbreaking to know that the students that were living there were still suffering. So the focus really became prevention. How do we get to the core of this issue, go where children and women are the most vulnerable and exploited, and stop it at its root? What are the reasons why trafficking can exploit the vulnerabilities of the humans in those communities? And how do you address those reasons? And it's complex, and where do you begin? And so in 2005, the organization that I was working with at the time, that started the anti-human trafficking network that I now lead. They were told by a ministry partner called, it was an organization called Voice of the Martyrs, that if you want to go where human trafficking is the worst, you have to go to the war zones of Sudan. And one of the leaders, the founders of this organization, she went and on a search, a fact-finding mission, and met our first Indigenous director named James Lualatak, who had been a child soldier and was released, grew up, and then came back to serve vulnerable children in his community. He was a lost boy, which for some of you may not know the history of South Sudan, but Sudan and South Sudan have been in the longest civil war in the continent of Africa. And for 5 decades, they've been nations at war. And just the exploitation and the trafficking for both child soldiering, labor trafficking, and sex trafficking is really off the charts in those regions. So it was it was following the right next step of a journey that was unfolding in my life, that I'm from suburbia, New Jersey. What do I have, this is not what I would have chosen per se, but just following the right next step. The right next step led me to this mission.
Yeah, no, it seems like a theme I'm hearing a lot lately personally, that, following that right next step is really the best way to live, I think also hearing you share a little bit, some of that I knew, some of it was new information to me from when we first met, but I think hearing all of that reminds me of why I think it was so easy for you and I to connect in the beginning, just because our vocational trajectory seems to have been similar in that we entered into work that was very complex with some of the most vulnerable people in the world without a lot of background and understanding on how to most effectively do that, and really learned on the fly, relationally with deep relationships with local leaders in those places in the world. So I think that's what I appreciate a lot about you, is the humble posture that you seem to have taken, as you've approached that work. Like you didn't come with answers necessarily, but you came with a lot more questions than you did answers,
For sure.
So that makes me wonder, just for you now that all of that has led you to be the CEO of Lift Up the Vulnerable, and through some, organizational changes, and, we got to work together through the idea of clarifying your messaging, like what is it that your organization does and how do you present that to the public? When you and I both know, like, as you mentioned, I really appreciate you mentioned this work is complex. It's not easy. And yet if we present the complexity to people, it can be overwhelming for them to just take in the complexity. So presenting the simplicity of what we do to address the complexity is really, I think, important. And I think you do that well, and what emerged, from your heart, that's now lives, on your website. Could you just speak to that a little bit, give a little bit of life to what that is? Like, what does Lift Up the Vulnerable do?
Yeah, so we prevent human trafficking and empower change makers in war-torn nations. And really at the core of who we are, and what we believe and why we do what we do, is this core value and core belief of that when you empower the vulnerable, the voiceless, not the voiceless, but the voice unheard, you know, the ones that
Mm.
whose voices have been unlistened to. When you empower the vulnerable, you transform the world. And so we're all about creating a movement of empowerment. And it first starts with, well, it first starts really at a core level. You know, that's the way I want to live. I've been empowered. I want to empower. And I work with a team of Indigenous directors who feel that same way. They've been empowered and they want to work to see their communities transformed and empowered. And so they're identifying the vulnerable in their local communities. Primarily that's orphans or children that have been displaced by the war, or have been displaced by extreme poverty, and have a really high number of reasons why they are exploited. When you live in, where we work, where we are working,
Yeah.
there is just such extreme poverty, and it really amplifies the great need of a local Indigenous movement, a grassroots movement to see transformation.
Yeah.
So so we take a real holistic approach, and we offer prevention first, but prevention looks like protection, education, and now stepping into economic empowerment to see communities transformed through these change agents that have been invested in.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Can we get, I'm sure we could take a deeper look at each of those areas, but for the sake of time, can you paint a little bit of a picture of each of the areas that you work in and the local leaders? Like maybe just give the first or last name or both of each of the leaders, the
Yeah.
local leaders in each of the areas where you work, and kind of without a map, maybe people go to the website, liftupthevulnerable.org, and see the Where We Work page and see the map that kind of pinpoints the different regions that you work in. But just walk us through that just real briefly if you can.
So Lift Up the Vulnerable, or LOVE, is our acronym, and we lead an indigenously directed anti-human trafficking network. We have 3 locations. The first and oldest location is called New Life Ministry, and it's along the border of Darfur in South Sudan. And it started really at the height of the Darfur genocide. So we were rescuing a lot of kids that were displaced from Darfur, that were also from that region of South Sudan. And the man that's the leader there is called James Luwalatok. He's the founder and leader. So he's been doing this work longer than me, but we've been partnering together for over 15 years. And then the second location that we began working in, James actually helped us connect to these other localities when we were, when his community was really beginning to thrive, and we did more and more each year. Our team asked him, you know, what else can we do? And instead of keeping the resources and the investment time and energy in just his community for just his people group, he wanted to make sure other regions of Sudan and South Sudan were taken care of too. So he said, well, actually, if you go to the border of Uganda, the people there are really vulnerable also. Wow. So he helped us get connected to the next location, which is called Hope for South Sudan. And the director is a man named Peter Lamago. And then the third location, we began working there in 2011, and it's in the Nuba Mountains of Sudan. And at that time, there was active genocide happening against the Nubian people. So bomber planes were flying over, the children were growing up, living and eating and playing around foxholes. And so the leader there is called Ezekiel, and all of our leaders are really compassionate, humble men who are committed to see transformation. They've experienced how someone investing in their life like created this movement of change for them.
Yeah.
And they want to just keep on passing that in their communities to see real big transformation, not just for a certain group of kids, but really at a community level. They want to see transformation for their nations.
Yeah. Wow, that's beautiful. Well, I'm saying it to you, although I'll say it to you, but I'm representing everybody that's involved in your work. Thank you for the work that you do. I love, one of the things that we love at Groundswell is to work with good people who do good work. And everything I've gotten to know about Lift Up the Vulnerable is you represent that really well. And I hope someday to meet the team or get to know the work a little bit further.
Yeah.
We talked about complexity, and this good people who do good work is not meant to be cliche or, too simple sounding. For me, I mean it deeply from my heart. And yet we talked about earlier, there's complexity in this work. So speak a little bit about that, if you could, just like what are some of the, and we all know this has been a challenging time in the world. 2020 has been a year that has presented a lot of challenges related to COVID-19 and the lack of travel. I know you probably would have been in the region a couple times this year, or teams would have gone there with you. But along with that, what are some of the challenges, the biggest challenges that you face in general and specific to COVID-19 that people might want to know about?
Yeah, so because of this long-standing war, which really ended in 2005, and then a peace agreement, and the South Sudan became its own independent nation, I believe in 2009. So there's, that's not that long ago, but it has been total infrastructure devastation. There's been very little, there's a lot of corruption. And at the government level, there's a lot of inciting of tribalism, profiteering from war. And so at the very basic level, there aren't infrastructures like hospitals. There aren't clinics. There are very few places for people to go to get medical care. So when a global pandemic happens, first of all, there's very few to little places to get any medical support at all in general. But then there's very few to little places to get testing. So it's a population that is extremely vulnerable just physically because of malnutrition, because of lack of access to clean water, because of lack of access then to medical care. And you really, as an organization working there, we have to tackle caring for children and helping them thrive at a very holistic way, because we have to feed them, we have to house them, we have to, make sure that there is clean water, protection. We're responsible for raising these students. And when the pandemic hit and things started to close down, we couldn't bring in food as easily. We couldn't bring in medical supplies as easily. We have our own clinics on site that do very baseline treatments, but even those were altered because they didn't have the access from international support. And so it was a really interesting opportunity for us to pivot the way that we're approaching our support of our Indigenous partners. And it really highlighted the need of our shift towards economic empowerment and how helping our partners become both food independent and financially independent as thriving organizations that are affecting their communities. And so one pivot that was really exciting, because of the war again, farming has really either been devalued, or the skill set has been lost, or the land, there's a lot of land. When Sudan was one nation, it was the size of 3 times Texas. So it's a big zone. It's a big span that's diverse, but it has the capacity, with investment to feed all of Africa. it really could be a source of great resources to its people and beyond. But war devastates, and lack of infrastructure really devastates. So we're addressing it from the ground level up. We're doing the groundswell there.
Yeah.
We're looking for what's moving, what's needed. Everything is needed, so where do you begin? And this past year, despite COVID, in 2019, we cultivated and harvested from 20 acres of land. But because of COVID, and we pivoted and were able to do more in this one zone while our schools were closed because the government shut them down, we were able to cultivate 50 acres of land. And so we took some significant strides to increase independence despite all that had happened. And some of that is because we have a partnership with Rise Against Hunger, who's helping invest skill and training and resources into that. But there's a lot of on the ground level desire to live life differently. And so it's really, the need is endless, really, and the possibility is endless too.
Sure.
So it's an exciting time to be working, just in spite of it all. We're really naming where the pain is and celebrating the gift that has come to.
I love that. So many things come to my mind, but as we wrap up, I'm thinking about how, again, our connection was very easy because I think we both approach things in a similar way, that kind of desire to get in the soil and work in the hard places in a very organic, holistic, relational way. And I love right from the beginning learning about the trajectory that you're on toward economic empowerment and independence, because that gives the most dignity to the people being served. You know, and the biggest thing to celebrate is that there's not at a long-term dependence on the organization. So I love that. I love your partnerships, you know, both with Indigenous partners and other organizations that you work with, knowing that you can't do it alone. So just so many things I love about the work that you're doing. And I would say out of this project, the thing that would give me the most joy is if even one person, you know, came to support or get involved in Lift Up the Vulnerable in some way. So why don't we wrap up with you just giving a little insight into how can people get involved? Is this interest, if this work resonates with them and, you know, resonates with their heart in some way and they're interested in getting involved, what are some simple ways people can jump in and get involved with you?
Well, first of all, you have to go to the website because Bill designed it. And you just have to celebrate him and let him know.
Thank you.
Let him and his team know how good they did, because it's really great. It's really
great teamwork.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you.
And then secondly, one of the things that you just mentioned that you actually helped teach me was about the power of collective impact. You know, I knew I didn't know the words, but I knew the possibility of how collective impact can help, and the really intentional way of working together and sharing information to solve complex problems. And we do that with partners, individuals, organizations, you know, at a real community level. And so one of the new initiatives that we've launched is something called the Love Collective. And it's a monthly giving program where people can engage with this, this exciting opportunity to empower children to transform their war-torn communities through a monthly gift of any size, that is helping stand in solidarity and also problem solve. You know, it's a complicated issue. There are steps we can take. There are things that we're achieving, and the more people that can get a part of the Love Collective, the more global good will be growing. So go to the website, sign up today.
That's great. Do that. Sign up for the emails. I love your emails and what you post on social media, on LinkedIn and Facebook. Just really invites people into the story of what's happening there. So I would add that for people to just, you know, engage in ways and just begin to really learn about the great work that you're doing and how well you communicate that on a regular basis and making sure people stay, you know, in touch with what's happening. So Well, thanks again. Thanks for the honor that it's been to work together with you. I look forward to more in the future. And yeah, I hope people check out the Lift Up the Vulnerable website at liftupthevulnerable.org. So thanks so much for your time, Audrey.
Thank you so much.
All right.